So I guess I'll start by saying that examples that involve shooting David tend to make me rather nervous, and particularly examples that involve shooting David when he laughs. So I want to stress at the outset that I didn't find anything in Helen's paper particularly funny. All right. I do want to start by trying to make sure that I've got the disagreements between Helen and David Roden in focus. According to David, international law and state practice recognize a virtually absolute right to resist political aggression. I don't think that the just war tradition takes this view, however. Instead, the tradition holds that sometimes capitulation is a moral duty. And while I can't really speak for Helen, I will anyway, and say that she agrees with the tradition, and indeed with David, that there is no automatic right to resist political aggression. I regard this as a rather weak and uncontroversial claim. One point of contention, however, seems to concern how often states should capitulate to political aggression. David seems to think that capitulation to purely political aggression is always required, although perhaps this is too strong a characterization of his view. I'm not sure about Helen's view of the matter. How one views this issue depends in part on how one is inclined to answer various counterfactual questions. Would frequent capitulation, in fact, encourage more aggression generally? Would justice be better served by frequent capitulation coupled with coordinated campaigns of nonviolent resistance? Such questions are speculative in nature and impossible to answer in any decisive way. A second issue is how we should calculate proportionality when considering the morality of resisting conditional threats. David seems to be making the strong claim that it is impossible for a reductionist to justify wars of national defense to protect non-vital goods, such as sovereignty and territorial integrity, when such wars involve large-scale injury or perhaps any injury to vital interests such as life and limb. Helen's paper outlines several ways in which a reductivist might respond to this challenge, and I won't try to discuss all of them in this brief commentary, but I would like to try to defend David Roden against a couple of Helen's criticisms. David offers two definitions of political aggression. According to his first definition, political aggression threatens non-vital interests, while genocidal aggression threatens vital interests. According to David's second definition, resistance to political aggression typically causes greater harm to the same group of people's vital interests than does capitulation. Let me read that again. According to David's second definition, resistance to political aggression typically causes greater harm to the same group of people's vital interests than does capitulation. Helen argues that the way in which this second definition focuses on the same group of people creates an internal problem for David's argument, which she illustrates with the following example. An aggressor state threatens to launch an invasion unless a victim state executes an ethnic minority within its borders. The victim state refuses to do so and escalates its self-defense to the point that the vital interests of some of its citizens are threatened, and so forceful resistance becomes a proportionate defense of those interests. So there's a kind of ratcheting up here, which is put in place in order to avoid a kind of circularity objection that Seth Lazar has raised. So the foreseeable consequence of the victim state refusing to capitulate is that the ensuing war kills fewer members of the ethnic minority, but many more of the state's other citizens than if the victim state had capitulated. And this sets up a dilemma. On the one hand, if everyone in the state counts as belonging to the same group, then that group is worse off for resisting. According to the second definition of political aggression, this means that the threat being repelled counts as political rather than genocidal aggression. According to David, it follows that the victim state should have surrendered to the threat, which seems to be a morally unacceptable conclusion. On the other hand, if only the members of the ethnic minority count as belonging to the same group, then that group is better off for the war, which means that the original threat does count as genocidal and should have been resisted. This makes more sense, but then Helen's question is, why shouldn't we count what happens to all of the other citizens when trying to decide whether resistance to the conditional threat is proportionate? It seems that we should take those other lives into account. I think that David can avoid this problem simply by dropping his second definition of political aggression, which I don't see as necessary to his argument. So let's go back to his first definition of political aggression as a threat to non-vital interests and genocidal aggression as a threat to vital interests. In Helen's example, the aggressor state demands the execution of the ethnic minority. which is a threat to the vital interests of many people and thus counts as genocidal. The aggressor state also threatens to kill many people if the victim state resists its initial demand, which makes the conditional threat genocidal as well. Now we have a demand for mass killing or a genocidal demand backed up by a threat of worse mass killing, that is, by a conditional genocidal threat. This description avoids the internal problem with David's argument that Helen identifies. There's also a second problem with the ethnic minority example, which is that the victim state is asked to harm the ethnic minority's vital interests in order to forestall an invasion. Whereas David is focused on cases where harm to someone's vital interest is not intentionally inflicted by the victim state, but is foreseen as coming about as a result of resisting the aggressor state's threat to non-vital interests. Now let me turn to a different example of Helen's in which an attacker threatens to rape Alice and tells her that if she resists being raped, then he will go on to rape several other women. Helen suggests that the best explanation of why Alice is justified in resisting the rapist is that each additional rape should be discounted as a foreseen rather than an intended side effect of her self-defense, and then discounted further because of his intervening agency. If the rapist had threatened to rape her daughter, then Alice also would have had a very strong offsetting duty of care, requiring her to submit in order to save her child. Alice's duty to care for her fellow citizens is much weaker, however. Indeed, the example suggests that our duty to care for our fellow citizens is not nearly as strong as David seems to think. Leaving aside such duties to care for our fellow citizens, then, Alice is required to submit when the sum of the discounted side effect harms is large enough, say when 20 or 30 will be raped and not 2 or 3. But if it is possible to discount harms to vital interests in this kind of case, it is possible to discount harms to vital interests incurred in defending non-vital interests. Suppose then that we are also defending a lot of non-vital interests, say the right of millions of people to vote. It is possible that this tips the balance in favor of resistance. This is not what David claims. Instead, he argues simply that when a greater number of vital interests will be harmed by resistance, a state should capitulate. I'm sympathetic to Helen's argument, but I have two worries. First, the rape example doesn't seem sufficiently analogous to what happens in war. So to illustrate this, let me give you a new version of the rape example. So in this case, Alice refuses to submit, the rapist attacks, Alice defends herself, and in their struggle, both the rapist and Alice are seriously wounded. And in addition, both the rapist and Alice manage to kill bystanders. And then, of course, this kind of example is multiplied many times over for the case of a war. And the only observation I want to make here is that at this point, trying to engage in this kind of complex aggregation and balancing of interests is quite difficult. Second, there's another objection that Seth Lazar has raised to aggregating lesser interests. The problem is that this suggests that states with larger populations might have more stringent rights of self-defense against political aggression. So I'll leave that objection for the Q&A. It seems to me that the reductivist has the best chance of justifying wars of national defense against political aggression when the aggregate harm to non-vital interests is serious enough that it results in a step change. This is the kind of case that Helen points out in her story about the Londoners who are denied the right to vote. In this kind of case, it looks like we can classify or redescribe what happens as a matter of capitulation as compromising vital interests. In this story, the people who lose their right to vote don't only lose their right to vote, they don't only endure disenfranchisement, but the permanent and grave oppression of a great many people. And I think that Helen is right that a simple distinction between vital and non-vital interests seems to obscure what is at stake in such cases. Of course, the general likelihood of such step changes is a highly contested matter. We might think that aggressor states that back up political aggression with conditional lethal threats already reveal themselves to be profoundly indifferent or hostile to basic rights, and therefore are likely to escalate their demands or go through with their threat to kill even after their initial demands are met. But of course, this is not always the case. Perhaps it's not even usually the case. I'm not yet convinced that it's impossible for reductivists to justify some wars of national defense against political aggression. But this brings us back to the other question, which is how many such wars can be justified from this perspective. Given the immense destructiveness of war, it's hard to believe that many such wars do or will in fact qualify as proportionate. And if most wars of national defense are not proportionate, then as David Roden argues, there is a myth about national defense that needs to be dispelled. There are, of course, many other unresolved issues raised in this debate. On what basis should we set the discount rate for foreseen rather than intended consequences? Does the distinction between foreseen and intended consequences make no moral difference, as some moral philosophers argued, some difference, or a great deal of difference? The same question arises for discounting based on intervening agency. As Thomas Herk has pointed out, we don't have a very good account of this matter, and a wide range of views seem possible. Another question concerns what kinds of lesser harms it's appropriate to aggregate and balance against more serious harms. It doesn't seem that the aggregation of certain kinds of lesser harms, such as having a headache, can ever outweigh very grave harms, such as dismemberment and death, although there's some consequentialists who disagree. So we need to know why it's the case that other kinds of lesser harms, like losing a right to vote, can be aggregated in the way that the reductivists suggest. Finally, one more question about balancing is how we are to estimate the weight of special duties to care for our fellow citizens. Again, is this just a matter of intuition, or can we find a more principled basis for assigning weights, one that doesn't beg any questions or merely confirm what we already believe? These are a few of the additional questions raised by Helen's discussion that we might pursue during the Q&A. Thanks.